We will try to get started close to on time. We have plenty of time tonight, and we're incredibly fortuitous to have two people that I feel have as much information as any two people on the planet about Mark Catesby, who I've been enamored with for a long time. I'm not a historian, and I don't delve too much into the history. I delved into the ecology and the plant part, which I'll be talking about, but we're very lucky to have them here to speak with us tonight, and to have me babble about something. I don't know. I'll talk to you guys about something. But we're really happy to have you. We really appreciate you supporting us. And if you haven't been out to the South Carolina Botanical Garden, please come out to the Botanical Garden. The Natural Heritage Garden Trail is actually part of the story that I'll be telling about Catesby anyway, and part of the story of Catesby himself. So if you've ever wondered kind of what South Carolina might have looked like when Catesby was wandering around these parts, a great place to experience that is South Carolina Botanical Garden. The other thing that you should do if you're over there is definitely step foot into the Hanover House, which is a house that was around when Catesby was traveling in the Low Country, and the kind of house he might have spent the night in. So really wonderful to have you here tonight. And I'm going to have David Elliott introduce our first speaker, who has come quite a long ways to speak with us tonight.
Well, Patrick, many thanks. Our first speaker is Dr. Charles Nelson, who has got a rather distinguished career. Born in Northern Ireland, educated his undergraduate degree in Wales. His PhD was earned at the National University of Canberra, Australia, and he worked for many years in the National Botanical Garden in Dublin. In more recent years, he's been the editor of a journal called the Archives of Natural History, and I came to know him about 3-4 years ago when I was looking for an editor of a book that many of you know called The Curious Mr. Catesby, and Charles was recommended to me by someone from the Linnean Society of London as an outstanding editor, researcher, and writer. And I can assure you that he's outstanding in every direction that way, and in fact has earned Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Society for the History of Natural History, from the Linnean Society of London, the Royal Irish Botanical Garden, and the Royal Horticultural Society in England. So I think that's enough to give you a taste of his work as the Catesby Trust's Senior Research Director, Charles Nelson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be here. It's my first visit to Clemson. It's not my first visit to South Carolina, but I nearly didn't get here for reasons which I think you all know about. And I thought, therefore, it would be appropriate to go back to September 1722 and remind you that Mark Catesby also experienced a hurricane. In fact, next week is the anniversary of the hurricane which he described in a letter of the 9th of December 1722 to his patron and friend William Sherard. It's interesting that he described an event which seems almost to have been more severe than Irma, because he says that the trees were disrobed of their leaves, cones, and seed, so he couldn't collect any. And he was explaining this to Sherard because Sherard was expecting large quantities of seed as well as specimens from Catesby to share with his fellow patrons. Later, in April of the following year, Catesby was at Fort Moore, and he heard a story about a great inundation of the plain. The waters rose 29 feet in less than 40 hours. And he said that proceeded only from rain that fell on the mountains. And whether that's directly connected with the hurricane which he had experienced himself in September, or whether there was another storm, in fact there was another storm that came through the Gulf of Mexico about that time, is very difficult to know. But Catesby's description of the hurricane in 1722 was not known to hurricane scholars until I drew their attention to this unpublished material earlier this year. Anyway, let's forget about Irma. She's probably the only person who can knock Donald Trump off the news pages over in Britain, but she did it with a vengeance, because the BBC was absolutely full of the consequences of the storm. And as I said, I almost didn't get here, but there we are. The rough outlines of Mark Catesby's life have been clear for more than 80 years, well, for exactly 80 years, since 1937, when Dr. Elsa Allen published her paper entitled New Light on Mark Catesby. An obituary of Catesby had been published very soon after his death at the end of 1749, but it was Dr. Allen who unearthed the details of his origins and of his birth and baptism. She it was who found the parochial records for St. Nicholas's Parish Church at Castle Hedingham in Essex, which tell us that Mark was born on the 24th of March. Now, 24th of March is a significant day because that is New Year's Eve in the old calendar. And therefore, although Dr. Allen assumed that he was baptized 12 months later, he was actually only baptized 6 days later, because the year changed to 1683 on the 25th of March. It's just one of the many confusing things about Mark Catesby. We've known for a long time that he was buried on the 27th of December 1749 at St. Luke's Parish Church, Old Street in London. The church, as it is today, is much restored because it was virtually destroyed in the Blitz in the Second World War. And there is no sign of Mark Catesby's grave anymore. The mourners who attended the service in St. Luke's would undoubtedly have included his widow Elizabeth, perhaps his 12-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and his stepdaughter, another Elizabeth, as well as his youngest son, called Mark, then 9.5 years old. But there is still much we do not know about Catesby. Where and by whom was he educated? Did he go to university? Where did he learn to read French and Latin? He doesn't tell us in the few biographical fragments that are contained in his great The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. He doesn't even give us clues that might lead us to any answers. So we've got to look elsewhere, hoping that the sources that we have are accurate and trustworthy, and this has been a major problem. One significant source is a letter written by the ornithologist and author and friend of Catesby, George Edwards. Indeed, he was his pupil because Catesby taught him how to engrave. The letter is now in the Morgan Library in New York and was written to Thomas Pennant, who was another ornithologist and author in 1761. But it was not until this year that information became available that showed that, in fact, Edwards's letter is more accurate than we believed. Most noteworthy was his remark that Catesby was known to the famous English naturalist John Ray. And as you can see there, it says he happened in his youth to fall into the acquaintance of John Ray. What caused doubt was the additional information that Edwards gave concerning Catesby's death, saying that I believe he was 70 when he died, but also going on to say that he fell while crossing Holborn, was knocked senseless, and was taken home to his wife, where he died a few days later. He died, Edward said, having received in his fall a bruise on his head, which might cause his death, or the fall might be from an apoplectic fit. Edwards also added the detail that he had his son with him, a boy of 8 years old, who could give no satisfactory account. Mark was put into a coach, carried home to his wife in that condition. Well, we knew that there was a son of Mark Catesby, christened Mark, in St. Giles Cripplegate in London in late May 1731. In December 1749, that boy would have been a strapping lad of 18 and surely would have been able to help his father at least get up and get into a carriage. But clearly that boy was no longer alive. Yet when he died, I cannot discover any record of his burial. And it's inconceivable that Elizabeth and Mark would have christened another boy, this one born on the 26th of June, 1740, with the name Mark, had his older brother and namesake been alive. So the older boy definitely was dead. Thus, Edward's account is really no longer troublesome. He was largely accurate, and we can trace the younger Mark further. This is new information which, again, only came to light this year. The younger boy, the one born in 1740, turns up again in apprenticeship deeds in 1759. And this says, Mark Catesby, son of Mark Catesby, late of the parish of St. Luke, in the county of Middlesex, gentleman, is bound to Francis Rooker for a period of 7 years as a watchmaker. Mark Catesby was then turned over to another clockmaker, as was common with apprentices, in a few years later, as is indicated on the left. The apprenticeship fee was £25, which was a very large sum of money. It's also noteworthy that Mark, his father, was described as a gentleman. As I pointed out when speaking about Mark Catesby at the launch of the book in 2015, Mark Catesby was consistently addressed as a gentleman. That's a title, a status of a man who does not have to work for his living. His son's status was obviously not that of a gentleman. The family had come right down in the world. But Mark Catesby Sr. was always addressed as a gentleman. We don't have to rely entirely on George Edwards for some of these details. And his letter's authority is actually supported by another contemporary diary. In May 1748, the Finnish-Swedish naturalist Per Kalm, the man after whom Kalmia is named, visited London on his way to North America, and he almost certainly had instructions to go and see Catesby. Met Catesby at a meeting of the Royal Society and spent an afternoon with Catesby at his home. And sometime later, Kalm recorded the event in his diary, and I think this is a contemporary record. It's not something that was recollected many, many years later, unlike Edwards's account. The particular portion of Calm's diary was not printed in the edition published in 1753, which was translated into English in 1772, and it's only present in the original manuscript, which was not published until very recently. An English translation has been made available, and although not perfect, makes this new information more accessible about Catesby's origins. Calm said he had been born in Essex about 6 miles from Mr. Ray's birthplace, where Ray had spent most of his time and died and was buried. When he was a small boy, Mr. Catesby had often visited Mr. Ray. Calm then makes an extraordinary observation. And it's curious, he says, that a large number of the leading men in natural history came from Essex. And he mentions Ray to start with. He then mentions Dale, and that is Samuel Dale, who was the man who received most of Catesby's material from Virginia between 1712 and 1717. Mortimer, who is Cromwell Mortimer, who was the secretary of the Royal Society in Catesby's days. Calm adds, and his son, but in fact I've not been able to trace any Mortimer, younger Mortimer, who was a naturalist, and Catesby. That's the kind of information that Calm would only have obtained by talking to those people themselves. Mortimer, by the way, was the man who described Catesby's natural history as the most magnificent work I know since the art of printing has been discovered. Well, Ray lived at a place called Blacknotley, and Blacknotley is not that very far from where Catesby was born, or where we think Catesby was born, although we actually have no definite evidence of the place. Here's Samuel Dale, and a cartoon on the left illustrating Cromwell Mortimer. Mortimer obviously was a figure of fun in London in the 1730s. Castle Hedingham is, I don't know if I got a pointer on this, but Castle Hedingham is it's actually on that as Hedingham Castle. And Ray lived at Blacknotley. The distance is not 6 miles. According to Mr. Google, you can walk there in anything from 3.5 to a little over 4 hours, depending on which route you take. The straight one is 3.5 hours. I find it extraordinary that a young boy would have made that journey by himself to see John Ray in the 1790s. England was not a safe place in those days. So I presume that he would have gone with an adult, maybe his father, maybe someone like Samuel Dale. If he was actually to travel from his hometown of Sudbury, Sudbury is marked on the old map, just there in the upper right, the walk would have taken him somewhere in the region of 5 hours. So how he got to know Ray is still a bit of a problem, but it's quite possible that Samuel Dale had something to do with it, because Dale was Ray's executor and a much closer neighbour. Moving to the other side of Catesby's life and considering his legacy, some more biographical fragments are of interest to us, and they're contained in one of the fine copies of the Natural History which survive in England. This is the copy which is now owned by the Earl of Derby and is in Derby's library at Knowsley Hall outside Liverpool. It once belonged to Peter Collinson, who was Catesby's friend and who was the witness of Elizabeth Catesby's will. This is an extremely interesting copy, slightly more interesting than I was led to believe, because what you see there on the left-hand side is Georg Ehret's magnificent hand-coloured engraving of Magnolia grandiflora, the plant which flowered in a garden at Parson Green in the late 1730s. Parson Green, by the way, is the place where the bomb was detonated this morning in London. Then it was a tiny little village and certainly didn't have an underground station. Collinson has annotated his copy. I'm a great fan of annotating books, and I'm so pleased that he scribbled all over this one, because he gives us a lot of very interesting information. He's an extensive annotation on the flyleaf as well as on the title page. The most significant of Collinson's annotations is on the front end paper, concluding with this. It afforded a subsistence to himself, that's talking about Catesby and his book, his wife and 2 children to his death, and his widow subsisted on the sale of it for about 2 years afterwards. Then the work, plates, etc., sold for £400, and about £200 more left by the widow was divided between the 2 children, a son and daughter. Rather difficult to understand. What does this signify? It must mean that the copy which Catesby himself retained, containing the original watercolours on which he based the engravings, was sold about 1752. The originals are, some of the originals, of course, are on display in the Gibbs in Charleston at the moment. Plates certainly refers not to those watercolours, but to the actual engraved copper plates. 222 for the natural history itself, and 17 more for the posthumous Hortus, which was published in the 1760s. So they fetched, let's say, £400. The 200 more left by the widow is explained by another recent discovery, a probate notice granting £200 worth of annuities not mentioned in Elizabeth Catesby's will to Jekyll Catesby, her nephew. And this is the probate record of that particular annuity. It's quite possible that this was the source of the £25 for young Mark's apprenticeship. The figures given by Collinson roughly correspond with the information in George Edwards's letter to Thomas Pennant, the one that's in the Morgan Library, who said that Catesby's whole fortune, household stuff, copy of his history, original drawings, and copper plates did not amount to £700. The £100 odd difference can be explained by Catesby's household stuff. Putting these facts in context, we know that Catesby's partner, Elizabeth Rowland, whom he married in 1747, although they had evidently been a couple since 1730, died about mid-February 1753, and probate was granted on the 29th of August 1753, as shown here. Apart from the cost of her funeral, £10 to her daughter, that's Mark's stepdaughter, and a copy of the second volume of Mark's book to Jekyll Catesby, her nephew, everything was divided equally between the 2 other surviving children of Mark Catesby, Anne and Mark. There is no mention, you will notice, in her, there's no mention in her will of her husband's original watercolours or of the copper plates, underlining the proposition that these had been sold before her death. In essence, Elizabeth Catesby's death cleared the way for the production of the second edition of the book under the editorship of George Edwards. Did Edwards buy the original paintings and copper plates? It's quite possible he did. Otherwise, I don't know how he could have produced this book. On the 23rd of October 1753, a proposal for reprinting by subscription, The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands was issued. And there's a unique copy of this proposal in the Houghton Library in Harvard. 1754 title page clearly identifies Edwards, George Edwards, as the editor, with Marsh and Wilcox as the publisher. Some copies of Catesby's The Natural History with the 1754 title page, the so-called second edition, comprise only pages of the original printing, which means that they're really not second edition. But others, including the copy in Missouri Botanical Garden, have the text entirely reset. Here's the proposal, here's a later proposal of 1756, which is rather remarkable. This is 2 years after the publication of the so-called second edition. A proposal by Marsh, Wilcox, and Sitchell, the latter is not named on the original proposal, for republishing by subscription The Natural History of Carolina. So Catesby published it in parts, and they were proposing to publish it in parts again. How many copies of the 1754 second edition were printed and sold is completely unknown. In fact, most people ignore it. Then after a gap of another 17 years, the London publisher Benjamin White again issued an edition of Catesby's book, again revised by George Edwards, it is said. And this is the title page of the 1771 edition. It had added a Linnaean index that is bringing the nomenclature up to date following Carl Linnaeus's binomial system. Edwards was still alive when this was produced. Thus, by 1771, there had been 3 printings of the text, at least. Actually, there were more, because some of the early pages of the first 4 parts were also reprinted. They can be identified in several ways. This, for example, is the preface. And the top left is the preface of 1732, which I've also seen in copies with the 1754 title page. The second one is the 1754 preface, which I've also seen in copies with the 1771 title page. And the last one is the 1771 issue. They can also be identified by some of the printing. Here is the lovely ornamental headpiece for the account, which was issued by Catesby in, actually not 1732, but 1743. By the way, surfing the web earlier this morning in our hotel, I discovered the source of the head of the Indian in the center of this. It comes from one of the very famous illustrations by John White, made in Virginia in the late 1590s. So Catesby was adapting something which he was familiar with, because this was in Hans Sloane's collection. Catesby's work was copied by many others. In the early 1750s, the Gentleman's Magazine reproduced a number of Catesby's images with accompanying text. The illustration of the rice birds, for example, was headed an article on the devastation of the Carolina crop by the birds after the unfavorable dry summer of 1751, result of which exports of rice to England dropped from 100,000 barrels to 60,000. The Gentleman Magazine plates were engraved by J. Cave, I don't know his first name, who was presumably a relative of the proprietor of the magazine, Edward Cave. And here are some of the rather crude examples from the Gentleman's Magazine. These are often overlooked. I'd now like to turn just to Catesby's legacy as here in America. You don't have to go to Windsor Castle to see originals. You can actually see original Catesby's in the Morgan Library in New York. A version of the last plate in the second volume the plant called Catesby, lily-thorn from Bahamas, which was named after him by Johann Gronovius, and also part of one of the plates showing Plumeria rubra. In the published book, the Catesby is accompanied by the zebra swallowtail butterfly, and the Plumeria is complete. There's also, that's the Morgan copy and the published copy. There's also his watercolor of the scarlet snake, which is not quite the same as the one published, and is accompanied in the published by the sweet potato. The Morgan also has important manuscripts, and there are other manuscripts in the Library of Congress. Shortly after he arrived in Charleston in 1722, he wrote to his niece, and that is the letter on the left, dated June the 22nd, from Charles City, as Charlestown temporarily was called. It's simply a matter of saying I'm here, really. The letter on the right, which was written from Hoxton after he got back to England, is particularly interesting because it says that he's including uncoloured copies of the first part of his book. The copy which Jekyll Catesby had, which is now in the Morgan Library, also contains a number of important manuscripts, not least of which one page on the left is Catesby's manuscript of the descriptions in English for the plants and animals that are published in the appendix. This is, first one is for plate 4. Interestingly, it does not include the parallel French text. It's only the English text. And then there is George Edwards's letter to Thomas Pennant, which is the manuscript on the right, and that's the one that I've been discussing. The inscription in that particular copy indicates that it came from Jekyll Catesby. That is the nephew of Elizabeth Catesby and Mark, who was a haberdasher in Covent Garden. And it is the one that is mentioned in Elizabeth's will. I give to my loving cousin, Jekyll Catesby, a second volume of Mr. Catesby's Natural History to make his set complete. She went into that detail, but she doesn't mention her husband's original paintings. Who was Elizabeth Catesby? Again, new information suggests that she was Elizabeth Appleby, who married Henry Rowland in 1722. The top one is the marriage. The second one is a record of her husband's death. And the third one is a record of the birth of her daughter Elizabeth, that is Mark's stepdaughter. Returning to Mark Catesby, I said he was a man of property, he was a gentleman, he had sufficient income to buy books. In 1720, he had enough spare cash to pay for this rather handsome copy of Aesop's Fables, and it's the only book that we know that bears his signature. Here, that, by the way, is in a private collection in the United States. His copy of the Flora of Russia, given to him by his friend Johann Amann, is in the Smithsonian in Washington. But he had other books. For example, we know he had a copy of Hortus Cliffortianus, which was privately printed by the Anglo-Dutch horticulturist George Clifford. And Clifford was one of the richest merchants in Amsterdam. He printed his hortus at his own expense and does not sell copies, but is very liberal in making a present of it. So, as Gronovius told Cadwallader Colden of New York, if you collect some seeds for Mr. Clifford, he'll send you a copy of the book. Undoubtedly, Catesby got his copy because he swapped his book with Clifford. We know also that when he came out to Carolina in 1722, Catesby carried a copy of the famous book by Francis Willoughby, The Ornithology. We don't know where his copy is. It probably didn't survive the voyage. But this was edited by John Ray, and so there's another link with Ray, the great naturalist. Just as Catesby sought subscribers or encouragers for his book, he also became a subscriber and encourager for others. This is his name in the subscription list to George Edwards's A Natural History of Uncommon Birds. He also subscribed to a large paper edition, that's a very large book, of Philip Miller's famous Gardener's Dictionary, in which Catesby is mentioned as introducer of a number of plants. And rather strangely, he was a subscriber as late as 1746 to a book translation of Theophrastus's History of Stones. Why he was a subscriber to this, we don't know, but lots of fellows of the Royal Society were, and Catesby was a fellow by this stage. As I said, Catesby had his encouragers. Particularly important were the 12 men who supported his trip to Carolina. They were named in the preface individually. Of particular interest, I just mentioned the Earl of Oxford. In the 1732 preface, he was named Thomas, Earl of Oxford. Well, in fact, he wasn't Thomas at all. He was either Robert or Edward. Robert, the first Earl of Oxford, died in 1724. So that when Catesby sent seeds and a tub of plants from Charleston in August 1724, the first Earl was already dead. He was succeeded by his son, Edward, and it would have been Edward who subscribed then to the 2 copies of the Natural History of Carolina that are mentioned as beside their names in the list of encouragers. Edward Harley died in June 1741. His widow sold his library to a London bookseller called Thomas Osborne, getting less for the library than the cost of binding all the books. And in the list of this particular library, which was compiled by the great Samuel Johnson, we find 2 copies of Catesby's Natural History listed. One described as the first volume and 4 numbers, that's the lower one. The other one apparently complete. There is a copy of Catesby's Natural History in Lehigh University, Pennsylvania, which came from the sale of Lord Oxford's library. As you can see, Richard Chiswell paid £19, 9 shillings and 6pence for it. Which copy it is, I have not yet managed to discover, and it will be interesting for future research to try to work out what it is. 80 years ago, the modern era of Catesby scholarship was initiated, as I said at the beginning, by Dr. Elsa Allen. Her papers are deposited in Cornell University, and while she published the results of her research, the archive might well be worth looking at and doing a little bit of archaeology on it, in case there are items in it mentioned that no longer exist. After all, we've been through the Second World War since she did her work in the 1930s. I'm particularly intrigued by this. Includes a copy of Mark Catesby's birth certificate, because I'm sure there were no such things like that in 1683, so I don't know what that is. Of the making of many books there is no end, as the Old Testament author of Ecclesiastes wrote. Likewise, there's no end of research. Catesby has been the subject of many books, and more are certain to be made, yet he remains mysterious. His curiosity resulted in his extraordinary natural history. a work that was in print for 9 decades. It has hardly any modern equivalent in that regard. There are copies where you will see dated watermarks 1816. In 2013, when I became involved with this curious man, the idea that there was anything new to be discovered about him was almost unthinkable. Yet his life story has been extensively revised in the last few years. He has emerged as an unconventional family man in a rather modern relationship outside conventional marriage. He was a man of substance, a gentleman, owner of property, with the leisure to travel and paint. But he was also an artisan, crafting exquisite copper plates, which survived into the 19th century. He used his wealth to create a superb book. An accident ended his life before he had time to make proper provision for his wife and young family. But he was never destitute, and they were not impoverished. He did not come here as a jobbing explorer trying to make ends meet. He was a man of substance. He was a respected fellow of the Royal Society, and queens, princesses, dukes, earls, and jobbing gardeners alike shook his hand. He was the curious Mr. Catesby. He gets curiouser and curiouser the more we discover about him. The questions proliferate. We've not yet written, and probably never will write, an ending to his story. Thank you. I don't think so. The only manuscripts and so on of that period are in the Library of Congress, because that branch of the family, which is represented by a couple here tonight, the Koch family, gave their papers eventually to the Library of Congress. I wish we could find out a lot more about what he did in Virginia. It's one of the great mysteries. What did he do for the 5 years he was in Virginia, apart from going to Jamaica on a holiday or whatever?
I'm introducing you. Oh, I thought. My problem. Sorry, David. Okay, so let me get his presentation up here. Okay, our next presenter is David Elliott, who I've grown quite fond of. He's a great friend of Catesby and a great friend of natural history in South Carolina. We owe the Catesby Commemorative Trust to him. He's the executive director and founder of the trust. So much of the recent renaissance and interest in Catesby in the Carolinas and elsewhere in the United States really is due to him. David is from England, educated at Trinity College, and he worked for 37 years at Procter & Gamble with International Division. And we're extremely lucky to have David here to talk to us tonight about some of the extraordinary things that are happening with Catesby to a much wider audience. Would you like this one? The clicker.
Patrick, thank you very much. And see if I'm smart enough to figure out how to get this thing to work. We'll give it a try anyway.
To search after plants and other productions in nature was much suppressed by my residing too remote from London, the centre of all science. Yet my curiosity was such that, not being content with contemplating the products of our own country, I soon imbibed a passionate desire of viewing those of countries which were strangers to England. This intention, I set out from England for America, where I arrived the 23rd of April, 1712.
This afternoon, you'll hear how an English naturalist, born almost 350 years ago, is having an impact on American education today. How we got here is in the first part of this story. The Catesby Trust's first project was the Curious Mr. Catesby documentary. Research for this movie was started in London in 2003 at the Royal Society and the Linnean Society of London. This was followed by a pre-script conference in the Low Country involving the producer-director of the documentary, Cindy Neal, scriptwriter Mark Purswell, whom Cindy wanted standing in the swamps being bitten by mosquitoes like Catesby had been, Henrietta Ryan from the UK, who's formerly deputy keeper at the Royal Library in Windsor Castle and an expert on Catesby's paintings, and Leslie Overstreet from the Smithsonian, curator of rare natural history books, an expert on the publication of the book, and Alan Fiducia, professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina and author of Catesby's Birds of Colonial America. Over 3 days of venturing around the Low Country, a common understanding of the shape of the script was reached, with an emphasis that it be accurate. As Cindy noted, it was remarkable that 6 people with totally different backgrounds and who are unknown to each other could come together and reach solid agreement in such a short period of time. Filming in the Low Country, Washington, D.C., and in England was completed in time for the movie's world premiere in November 2007 at the Royal Society in London. Sir David Attenborough attended and was enthusiastic at the conclusion of the showing in his "Well done, well done." A red carpet, black tie U.S. premiere followed at the Satili Theatre in Charleston, and then a showing in D.C. as part of the 40th anniversary celebrations of the Smithsonian Libraries. Next came a 3-year run on U.S. public television. We'd been advised that securing broadcasts on 50% of the stations would be an excellent result. We were therefore delighted when we achieved 65%, including virtually all of the major TV markets, for a total of 1,300 broadcasts in the 3-year period. 30% of them were in prime time. A decade later, it's still broadcast periodically on ETV. While the documentary could well have been the end of the road, the Trust Board decided that the tercentennial of Catesby's first arrival in North America should not be ignored. The result was a week-long symposium that started at the Wilton House Museum in Richmond, Virginia, with supporting events at the Commonwealth Club and the Garden Club of Virginia's Kent Valentine House. We then moved on to Washington, D.C. and the Baird Auditorium and the National Arboretum in D.C., and then finally to the Charleston area, where we were fortunate in being able to attract as speakers almost all of the relevant experts from both sides of the Atlantic. You want to see a rogues gallery? There it is. They covered not only Catesby's work and life, but also who and where influenced him, and in turn, who and what he influenced. In addition to this comprehensive array of speakers, we organized several special events, such as displays of Catesby's etchings and books in Richmond, another such display in D.C., as well as the National Arboretum doing a special display of Catesby plants. We then moved to Charleston, where we had exclusive house, garden, and nature tours in Charleston at Middleton Place and Kiowa Island. When the symposium was over, we realized that the presentation deserved a wider audience than had been able to hear them in person. However, rather than simply publish the papers of the symposium, we decided we should produce a book. We were very fortunate in locating an outstanding editor in England, whom you've just heard speak. Dr. Charles Nelson had just completed his term as editor of the journal, The Archives of Natural History. As I learned, he's not only a demanding editor, but also an outstanding researcher and writer. Almost all the papers were completely rewritten, and some were completely new. Charles even had me writing a chapter myself, my first attempt at anything that had any relationship to academia since I graduated from college a long time ago. In a process that occasionally seemed like herding cats, at times having to play good cop and bad cop with our outstanding group of authors, the book was submitted to and accepted by the University of Georgia Press. Georgia is one of the two top university presses that publishes work on natural history, and we're delighted with the really beautiful job they have done of designing and printing our book. To help promote this book, we produced this video. Oops, back up, back up, back up. Oops, 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 oops. Excuse me.
In the early 1700s, hostile Indians, malaria, and rattlesnakes made America's southern colonies a perilous wilderness. Despite its dangers, a young Englishman arrived there in 1712 to begin his life's work. 29-year-old Mark Catesby left behind a comfortable life in a civilized society. Who was he? What drove him? Why should we care? These questions and many more are answered in this exciting new book. Are you interested in art, botany, history, birds, gardens? The fascinating work of Mark Catesby promises to captivate you. Catesby spent 20 years producing a magnificent 2-volume opus. His natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands has page after page of stunning artistry. It's at the standard for artists and naturalists for generations and generations to follow. Its illustrations include the Carolina parakeet, the ivory-billed woodpecker, and the passenger pigeon, all now extinct. Mark Catesby's work propagating the American magnolia and catalpa trees in England is important to this day. 100 years after him, John James Audubon was influenced by Catesby's drawings. naturalist Charles Darwin consulted Catesby's work while developing his theory of evolution. The renowned Swedish botanist Linnaeus relied on Catesby's work when writing his respected Classification of Species. Catesby was among the first to make scientific observations on bird migration and on the impact of habitat destruction. As an adventurer, Catesby developed his information while hiking hundreds of miles. He navigated wide rivers and dark wilderness streams in a small cypress canoe and outlasted vicious storms inside bark huts. Lewis and Clark studied Catesby's work before their famous journey toward the Pacific. Catesby's achievements connect him to the early history of North America and also reveal much about British society. His sense of adventure and wonder helped to shape our understanding of life in the long ago past. For 3 centuries now, an ever-growing circle of enthusiasts has puzzled and searched to find out more about Mark Catesby. This book brings together 23 of the world's experts to delve into every aspect of Catesby's remarkable talent and work. You are invited to join us for an exciting journey through new information, new ideas, to learn who was this very curious man. Mark Catesby.
To introduce the book, we made our own journey with a promotional roadshow that started at the Grolier Book Club in New York, Cincinnati's Museum Center, Richmond's Wilton House Museum, 1748 Charleston Library Society, Savannah's Wormslow Plantation, the Georgia Center for the Book in Atlanta, and the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. We then headed to London. We started at Catesby's parish church in London, St. Giles Cripplegate, where in fact they had a special evensong for those of us on the tour. This was followed by a launch at the Linnean Society of London, and there you can see our patron, Sir Gillian Prance, Sir David Attenborough, who came back again, and our then President Jane Waring from Charleston, and then on to Sudbury, Catesby's hometown, as you've heard, and you have to put up with me and the mayor of Sudbury and another picture of Jane. We were amazed when we received the annual Literature Award of the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries at its annual meeting in Cleveland. Books of essays are very hard to get awards. And then 2 interesting streams came together in a remarkable example of serendipity. The work of the Catesby Trust with that of the School of Education at the College of Charleston, the Charleston County School District, and South Carolina Educational Television. Faculty at the college, together with curriculum specialists and teachers from the Charleston School District and ETV's Director of Education, had all participated in the Buck Institute of Education's workshop on a truly significant new teaching technique called project-based learning. It appears that project-based learning is where a successful future for American education will lie. The primary focus of this instructional technique is one that educators know is critical to deep understanding and achievement, namely student engagement. The concept of project-based learning involves the transition from teachers simply delivering information to students, which has sometimes been called drill and kill, to teachers becoming facilitators of student-driven learning. At the point where these educators were seeking ways to develop lesson plans using project-based learning, one of our trustees, a friend of the dean of the School of Education, gave her a copy of our book. Curious Mr. Catesby immediately struck a chord among the educators, and not just with Dean Welsh and her staff, but also with the superintendent of the school system, Dr. Garita Postlethwaite, and Director of Education at South Carolina ETV, Dean Byrd. A collaboration between these organizations and the Catesby Trust was quickly established and developed what has become to be known as creating a better way to learn. Faculty at the College of Charleston, curriculum specialists and teachers in the school system, under the immediate leadership of Professor William Veal, have prepared and implemented project-based lesson plans in science, art, and social studies based on the work of Mark Catesby for several elementary and middle school grades. They've been evaluated and the results have been positive. Several have already been uploaded onto both a new ETV educational website and onto the national PBS Learning Media site. You sense the involvement of the kids in these programs. The use of Catesby's work on one or more math lesson plans based on his use of weights and measures is currently under evaluation, and there are other possibilities that should be considered. An unexpected development came when Erin Lee, a professor of dance at the college, was loaned a copy of our book. She became excited by how she could use Catesby's work to introduce her students to concepts of nature in their dancing. Further, she's using it in dance classes at the North Charleston Elementary School for the Creative Arts. However, having produced and tested some really good lesson plans based on project-based learning and then posting them for teachers on the ETV and PBS Learning Media websites is far from the end of the journey. If you check the PBS Learning Media website for third grade art lesson plans, for example, you'll find there are a myriad of them. The challenge and the focus of the Trust's efforts in this area from here on is going to be helping teachers become aware of the value of the Creating a Better Way to Learn products. We'll do this through developing promotional materials, supporting participation in teacher seminars and presentations, and speaking about them as I'm doing here. I do hope you'll support us in this work, which will be of real benefit to our youngsters. We have a critical need to enhance their capabilities in an ever increasingly competitive world. And to close, here is a little video of Erin Lee's.
Catesby on Stage is a dance performance project that uses the drawings of Mark Catesby as inspiration for a dance. Mark Catesby was an English naturalist that came to South Carolina to record the plants and animals in their natural habitat. As a choreographer and dance educator, I wanted to use Mark Catesby's work as a jumping off point to make a piece that would integrate with curriculum standards. My students and I at the College of Charleston created the performance and then created creative movement lessons that were project-based for third graders to go through the same strategies that we use as choreographers and dancers. We started the students thinking about how is it that Mark Catesby, who is both a naturalist, a scientist, and an artist, was able to really capture the essence of the animals in the South Carolina habitat. We looked at illustrations of Mark Catesby's herons, and we talked about what is the body structure of the animal and how does that relate to the animal's habitat. So students had a chance to practice the movement of the heron, and how we go about doing that is we ask students to improvise movements as if they had long, thin legs, as if they had wide open wings, and then allowed them to move through space. So not only are they learning about it from a visual arts standpoint, they're learning about it kinesthetically, and because of that, they're able to make some permanent connections with the curriculum. We divided them into small groups, and they practiced and created their choreography to go with different types of animals. So we looked at the tree frog, rattlesnake, and the crab. These are the tools that choreographers use to make up movement for their dances. And so the student went through the same process in order to both learn about dance, but also to better understand habitat. My hope is that through Catesby on Stage, teachers can engage their students in kinesthetic learning about habitat and survival. So I hope you enjoy our performance and our creative movement lessons.
Well, that will give you a little summary of what we're about in this arena. If you feel like supporting our work, the Office of the Botanical Garden has some brochures about the Trust and a means of supporting what we're doing. Any questions? Yes, sir.
How did you transition from PNG in Sin City, Ohio to Catesby? You didn't elaborate any. If you could shed some light, I'm very curious about that.
I missed, I think, a little of your question, but I hope I got it right.
I repeated, I said, after 30 plus years at Procter & Gamble.
Oh, okay. I am.
In Sin City, we don't call it Cincinnati, we call it the Sin City, Ohio.
We retired to, my wife and I retired to the Charleston area when I retired in 1994. And during the usual acclimation process, when you settle into the Charleston area, we toured the local plantations. And at Middleton Place, I saw this huge book open to a picture of a big red bird. And I've been somewhat of a bird watcher ever since childhood in England. And I looked at this big red bird, and it said scarlet curlew, red curlew. And I said, there's no such bird. So I then looked at the title page of the book, and it said Mark Catesby, 1731. Well, that's 100 years before Audubon, and somehow that knowledge went into the back of my mind for almost a decade. And I've been involved in some video productions for a wildlife conservation group at Kiowa, and enjoyed working very much with the producer-director, Sidney Neal. And once we were through with those projects, we decided we'd like to work on a project together. And through her interest in wildlife conservation, my interest in bird watching and colonial era history, we landed on Mark Catesby. And so you've heard the rest of the story. Well, we'll now move on to a different kind of talk and get a third degree of expertise. Patrick, I don't think you really need any introduction to this audience. But he brings a valued and different use of his botanical expertise in the Catesby story by his understanding of the botany of the South Carolina and also to shorthand the topography of the state, the soil conditions. Catesby did not do a very good job of telling us exactly where he went while he was in South Carolina. But Patrick Patrick's been able to fill quite a few of the holes there, so we'll have him talk about it.
Okay, so Catesby, yeah. We're all here because of Catesby. And Catesby, we've heard, didn't do such a good job describing where he was. Now, you got to remember, in 1722, when Catesby lit in Charleston, there was Carolina, right? So a lot of people, much later in time than Catesby, didn't do a good job of telling people where they were either. You heard of a guy named André Michaux? Yeah, a famous French naturalist who came to the New World looking for new wood products and plants to take back to these states in France. And he collected a little plant called Aconibels, right? Of course, it wasn't called Aconibels back then. It actually didn't have the scientific name Shortia gallicafolia. That plant was just a plant, a small shrub, he called it, that he encountered near the town that would be demolished, called Kiwi, which was a Cherokee town. And when he gave directions, and this is, you got to remember, 50 years after Catesby, more than 50 years after Catesby traveled here. When he gave directions, he said, in the high mountains of Carolina. Well, there just weren't a whole lot of landmarks to be had. And you have to also remember that resources like paper were very valuable commodities in those days. So much so that when you go look at the old collections, which are part of the research I'm talking about today, there isn't just one finely pressed specimen on most sheets. You'll have 5, 6, 7, 8 things, and these were British lords that were laying things down that had been sent to them by people from the New World, and paper was such a rare commodity that you tried to hold on to as much of it as you could. So it really is amazing that Catesby did what he did here in South Carolina from 1722 up until the time he left South Carolina, went to the Bahamas, and back into England in 1726. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I have three people on my slide up here because the research I'm talking about today isn't my research solely. What I've done is bring expertise in identifying plants to some incredibly hard work that's being done by my two collaborators right back here, Amy Blackwell and Dr. Chris Blackwell, Dr. Amy Blackwell and Dr. Chris Blackwell. Largely because of them and their trips to London early on, and you should know, they weren't trips to visit Catesby. And I had no interest in Catesby at all, to be honest, when Amy came to me and asked me to work on this project. They were trips to go and haul these enormous scrolls, papyrus scrolls, out of the basement of the British Library and take pictures of them for another project that Dr. Blackwell works on called the Homer Multitext Project, which essentially makes images available for anyone to see of things like the Bank Scroll, which we took pictures of on my first trip to the British Library there in London. And the idea that was hatched that, at the British Library, at the Natural History Museum, London, there are all these collections from the colonial era in the New World, and particularly from the Carolinas, that we sort of look over because they're pre-Linnaean. They don't have a whole lot of taxonomic value, and essentially they're guarded in the halls of the Sloane collection. And not just everybody can knock on the door or afford a plane ticket to London to go look at these things, right? So the idea was to make these images available and to try and glean what information we could from those images. And the information that I was interested in gleaning upon first seeing them, it was kind of weird. I showed up there and I'd read the natural history and I'd admired it, but it wasn't something that weighed on my heart every day, and now it does. Because now every day I'm challenging myself with both what I learn more from the plants, from the words, and from the world itself, to understand better what Catesby's Carolina was like, which tells us more than we ever could know about our own interactions with the world around us. So everything we talk about today, every image I show you, you can actually get to and see on your own. If you want to read the papers that we've published together, read some wonderful blogs that Amy has put on here and Chris have put on here, then just search Botanica Caroliniana. It'll be the first thing that comes up. It's a Furman site. Dr. Blackwell is at Furman University. So it's a partnership between the South Carolina Botanical Garden and Furman University. Okay, so we know Mark Catesby because of the natural history. But in fact, over in at Oxford University and at the Natural History Museum, London, there exists a large number of specimens which had been looked at in the past by other botanists, but hadn't really been studied in great detail, partly because they were collected and named using John Ray's taxonomy. Okay? I usually put a picture of John Ray up here. He wasn't a pleasant-looking Puritan kind of guy. Okay? But he was a brilliant naturalist, but he didn't use binomials. And so because it predated Linnaeus, taxonomists have really rather overlooked it. It's kind of the thing to do some point in your life if you are a botanist, if you are a taxonomist. You go to the Natural History Museum in London and you peer through the Sloane collections and you take a look at some of the plants. But you know, how much can you really learn from those plants? Well, it turns out, in combination with what we learn in the natural history itself, in the text there, and in manuscripts that were written and letters that were written back and forth, we can learn a lot that helps us to reshape what South Carolina was and what South Carolina is today. So one of the things that we've been able to get at through looking at Catesby's collections is much more information about what it really means to be Carolinian. Okay? We all think we know what it means to be Carolinian, all right? But what does it really mean? What is a native? Okay? Have I been here long enough to be a native? I don't know. But certainly there are plants that we now can't say with any amount of assuredness that this plant is not native to South Carolina, because not only do we find Catesby specimens, but in some cases we find specimens by John Lawson, who was even earlier. And in some cases, we find specimens that date back to 1709 from what would become the town of Dorchester, South Carolina. They were collected by a chap named Joseph Lord, one of the earliest collectors and one of the finest handwriting of anybody. He was a Puritan who was educated at Harvard, so he had great handwriting. Not all these guys have great handwriting. That's one of the problems. So this tree, which you're probably familiar with, is catalpa. Right? A lot of us call it catalpa tree. We collect catalpa worms from the catalpa tree to go fishing because nothing catches fish as quick as a catalpa worm, right? And in Europe, this picture came from London. It is a very admired tree, and a matter of fact, this tree is the most photographed tree in the world, which is the catalpa tree that sits outside of Parliament in London. So the thing about this tree is, around here, we think about it growing in people's yards, or maybe you've seen it growing on riverbanks if you've happened to canoe down the Tiger River, the Santee, or the Savannah, or larger rivers in South Carolina. Do you have this plant? But there is not a single modern flora published to date that considers Catalpa bignonioides, southern Catalpa, to be native to South Carolina. When in fact, you know who described the species? Thomas Walter. Where'd he live? Banks of the Santee River, Berkeley County. What specimen did he look at to name it? One of John Fraser's. Where was John Fraser at in 1787, the year before he brought his collections to Thomas Walter? Well, he was traveling nearly the same route that Mark Catesby did 50 some odd years earlier. And in fact, Mark Catesby, and these are examples of some of the poorest examples of specimens in Catesby's collection. I should show you the really good ones, like the poison sumac. He did a remarkable job collecting and preserving plants that had to ride all the way back to England on a ship, imagine, right? And it really is quite fantastic that any of these things survived. But these were badly damaged, probably after Hans Sloane, actually for sure after Sloane had them in their barium, and there's, only the faint outline of leaf material in some of these specimens. Well, there's Catalpa bignonioides, 2 specimens from the Sloane herbarium. There's several specimens at Oxford too. And the interesting thing about this plant is if he got it, if he was the one who actually collected, if he didn't receive it from someone else, then he must have got it in South Carolina in 1723. Before, there would have been strong influence by at least European Americans of moving plants around in the horticultural landscape. I mean, 1723, Charleston wasn't much like Charleston today. Okay? There's a wonderful translation from French that we did in the Huguenot Society that I helped Richard Porcher with that talks about the streets of Charleston being lined with cactus. That was 10 years before Catesby visited. So there's, when you read through some of the information on these specimens, they're information that you don't get in the natural history. So and this is from a piece that was sent with the plant from Mark Catesby in 1724 when Sherard received the specimens from, or when they went into Sherard's collection at Oxford. So this was sent to Oxford by Catesby in 1724, and he says, I never saw this tree in flower, but I'm told it produces large white bell flowers. So he never saw it in flower. His specimen, though, isn't in flower. And in fact, he talks about in both the correspondence that he sent to Sir Hans Sloane and that ended up in Sherard's collection, he talks about the fact that that the seed that he sent the year before probably wasn't any good. And then later, in the next batch he sent, he describes the flower. The flower is white, with a mixture of yellow and purple and resembles in shape, blah, 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 okay? So he actually, the most interesting part of this is he says they grow near rivers, though very remote from the settlements. And pretty cool. If they were growing in the settlements, we would assume they had been cultivated. The same way we assume everything had been cultivated with catalpa east of southwest Georgia, because it's really a Mississippi drainage species from southwest Georgia all the way over the Apalachicola sort of area of Florida, drainage of Florida, all the way over through Louisiana. And we didn't think it was native to South Carolina because of Catesby. Now we have to come back and reassess. If Catesby really saw this plant, if he really collected this plant, then this plant must be South Carolinian. Well, the plants can tell us the opposite, which is really cool. I love it when plants talk history to me. That's really great. The plants can help us perhaps to shed light on where Mark Catesby visited during his time in the Carolinas. So one of the places that we know he spent a lot of time is up the Ashley River, okay? So we know kind of this red arrow here is kind of the Ashley District, Ashley River, where we know that Mark Catesby spent time and visited plantation homes and homes of the people that lived up in the Ashley River and the Goose Creek men and those folks. But we have no evidence that he made it up as far as the Santee River or as far as the French Huguenot settlements in French Santee. Places like Jamestown, which was founded sometime between 1680 and 1690. So those inhabitants have been there for quite some time by the time Catesby came here. So the interesting thing about some of our research is when we go back and we look at some of the specimens of Catesby's, it's kind of interesting how sloppy the taxonomy had been on these things in the past. People would look at these with kind of rose-colored glasses. And they would look at plant specimens and they say, well, this is Mark Catesby. It must have come from South Carolina. We don't know if that plant came from South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Bahamas. You know, we're assuming it came from South Carolina. Did he even receive it from South Carolina, or was it given to him? And then they look at it and they say, okay, that's a maple. It must be a red maple because it has teeth on it. But in fact, this is a very odd form of silver maple, Acer saccharinum, that only occurs in one spot in all of South Carolina. And we weren't really sure if this plant was native here because it's in Jamestown Landing, just below the 17A bridge on the Santee River, at the point where the French Huguenots first got out of the boat and began St. James Santee. Okay, well, so here is that population, and here is a specimen of plants that look identical to those plants that you see in the population today. So which came first, the tree or the people, right? We can't say for certain that this species is just native west of the Appalachians anymore. We have to consider the fact that the enormous population in the floodplain of the Santee River, which is very unique, high pH, high nutrient load soil that's been dumped there by the flooding of the Santee prior to the building of the dams upstream, provided a habitat that was very similar to what we see in the Appalachian region and points west where this plant was known to be native. Then the question becomes, did Mark Catesby visit the Santee? Maybe the plant can tell us too. So I think it's interesting also how much life has changed since the time that Catesby was here. I love to illustrate this by saying the word turd in public. The tumble turds, not just the tumble turds, but his martagon lily. His, the lily that he has over here is the Canada lily, which also we were not really sure if that plant grew in South Carolina. There's a red Canada lily, subspecies editorum, that's up here in the mountains. But the yellow Canada lily, that's a plant of New York State, not really a plant of South Carolina. So is this an example of something that Catesby saw in a garden in England and just drew it because he knew it was in America? Or not? Well, we can come back to that, but let's talk about tumble turds for a minute. How much have things changed since Catesby's time? You know, this is the most numerous and remarkable beetle kind of any in North America. All right, how many of you guys see way more tumble turds than you do every other beetle in North America? No. Dung beetles are incredibly uncommon today. Matter of fact, how many of you have even seen a dung beetle in South Carolina? 1, 2 people, okay? Well, in Catesby's time, do we think he was lying? Well, it turns out Catesby is really kind of like, he's the original Fair and Balanced. He really tells a fair story about the rattlesnake, about the black bear, about so many things that we kind of have to give him the benefit of the doubt that these things were pretty numerous in North America at that time. He says they appear in April and continue the summer months or till about September, at which time they disappear and no more seen till the following spring. Their constant employ in which they are indefatigable is in order to continue their species to provide proper nidi, which is sort of an older English word for nest, to deposit their eggs. This they do in forming round pellets of human dung. How many of us poop in the bushes outside? Right? Things have changed a lot since 1723. It's interesting. Jerry Reel, our historian here, told me that it was interesting when we started Clemson University. We were one of the first places, if not the first public university, to have flushable toilets and electricity when we opened our doors, right? The only problem was the kids that were coming here had no idea what a flushable toilet is, so they all used the bathroom right outside Tillman Hall in the bushes. So we had to teach the second year a class on etiquette. Part of it was how to pull that cord, right? So things have changed a lot in South Carolina, and the beetle, the common American dung beetle, today is incredibly uncommon. It's an uncommon, not just because we're not defecating outside, but as a matter of fact, the other common food source in terms of cattle dung is much less common today because a lot less of us have cattle, and those of us that do have cattle, all give them a shot of ivermectin, which poisons the young beetles for the deworming medication that we give to cattle. So today these beetles are actually quite uncommon. Now, this happens to be one of those yellow Canada lilies growing in South Carolina, in Abbeville County, South Carolina. We've found 2 populations of this plant since Catesby's time, since I thought Catesby was on crack saying that there were yellow Canada, right? So this one's in Abbeville County. We've also found it in York County. So yeah, Catesby. God, he even has a picture of a buffalo, doesn't he? You've seen this wonderful plate in the appendix. It's this picture of a buffalo, of a bison, and when I was a kid, really, that was the plate. When I saw that, I think I saw it first time when I was 14 years old. I was visiting a natural history museum, and I saw a copy of Catesby, and it was open up to that buffalo, and I said, man, this guy. Buffalo, and to me, even more amazing was not just the fact he thought buffalo were in South Carolina, but that this pink flowered locust tree, which only grows in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, could be found in South Carolina too. I thought, wow, definitely crack was invented before Catesby. So no, it was, but it is quite a surprising image, and it was one that was created after he had been back for a while. It's not something he probably even painted or even thought about in South Carolina. So we weren't really sure how accurate this would be. And the buffalo is believable. We know that buffalo were actually fairly abundant in South Carolina up until about the 1750s anyway. But he says about the tree, because of course he was much more interested in the tree than he was the bison. Right? He says, I never saw any of these trees, but at one place near the Appalachian Mountains where buffaloes had left their dung. And some of the trees had their branches pulled down, from which I conjecture they had been browsing on the leaves. What with the bright verdure of the leaves and the beauty of its flowers, few trees make a more elegant appearance. I visited them again at the proper time to get some seeds, but the ravaging Indians had burned the woods many miles around. What is he talking about? It doesn't sound like South Carolina. Buffalo, weird trees from the mountains of North Carolina growing here, and burning everything. And again, and over and over and over again, he talks about the fact that there's all these buffalo, there's elk, there are fire everywhere. And where is he talking about? Is he talking about Charleston, where things burn all the time? Is he talking about Aiken, where things burn all the time, where Fort Moore is, where we know he went? Or is he talking about farther up in the Piedmont, where it's hard to comprehend a landscape that might be more prairie-like than forested? Well, it turned out during our research that we actually found out that the plant specimens themselves of Robinia that he collected are not black locusts, as I thought they might have been, that he just made a pink flower because he saw the clammy locust growing in England, which is really a common horticultural plant in Europe. And it's not even clammy locust, which we find growing in the heights of the Appalachians up along the Parkway. It's Hartwig's locust, which is a plant that is only known growing from around the Highlands Plateau in Macon County and Jackson County, North Carolina, and nowhere else. He found this in South Carolina. Well, through our research, we actually looked at what his description was of where he might have found Robinia hartwigii. A hill close to the Savannah River, upstream from Fort Moore, where there was ironstone on the surface. Okay? That's ironstone. Bob McCartney knew a place just like this, crazy guy down in Aiken to hang out with. We went out, and sure enough, we rediscovered Robinia hartwigii for South Carolina, not seen, not reported since 1723 and 24. This is what the site looks like today. It is now the Aiken County Industrial Complex. The only surviving plant from what could be Catesby's original location for this plant is now at the South Carolina Botanical Garden and one in the city of Aiken Arboretum. However, since that time, we've also found another population right at the border of Devil's Fork State Park in Oconee County. So the range of this plant has expanded, and the cool thing is, just in 2012 and 13, did we start to discover what Catesby had told us about and discovered himself in 1723. That's pretty amazing to me. So my wife would say I have a man crush on Mark Catesby, and she's right. She's pretty safe. He's kind of cold now. But he traveled to South Carolina when really it was kind of backwoods. And just to show you how far away from the actual range of Robinia hartwigii, there's where we knew it from before our research. This is where we found it, down in Aiken County. Pretty wild, right? And more stuff I won't bother to read. But he was traveling here when the English settlements really extended inland only about 60 miles from the coast. Beyond that, in the old maps, they would have said, here be monsters, right? But not just that, but it was not wilderness. It wasn't unpopulated. As a matter of fact, it was incredibly engineered and it was incredibly managed, just not by people of English descent. We often forget that. What were the conditions like where Catesby was traveling? Now, you often think about, he must have been riding through these immense forests, and a squirrel could walk from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi, and he was riding along through the woods. No. These early explorers, not just Mark Catesby, but Mark Catesby, William Bartram, John Fraser, Andre Michaud, all the people that we think about traveling through the wilderness, they weren't really traveling through wilderness. They were walking on and riding on well-maintained roads like this. This is a picture of Cherokee Path, which has been maintained up at 96 Battlefield. You can actually walk on the old Cherokee Path. There was an incredibly complex system of trade routes that extended through South Carolina and throughout the whole continent of North America, really. And they were more like roads than they were little paths through the woods. They were well-worn, right? So when Catesby encountered the beautiful plants that bear his name now, like Gentiana catesbii and Lilium catesbii, he probably wasn't journeying through vast wilderness. He was journeying out in through territory that was well manned, though sparser than it would have been years before disease, by Native Americans. So we know a couple places outside of the general Charleston area that Mark Catesby visited. But the one that he made his base was a place that on his map he identifies as Savannah Fort, but in his text he constantly refers to as Fort Moore. You can still go to Beach Island and see the sign down in North Augusta for the location of the historical Fort Moore. The question is, how did he get there? Can our plants tell us anything about that? And where did he go from there? Because he says he got to within sight of the mountains. But was it really within sight of the mountains? Or was it within sight of the fall line? Or was it within sight of the tiny little mountains, the little hills that we have in Abbeville County? Where did he go? Well, the plants can help us to answer some of this. So there's a couple of routes that he could have made travel. Back in those days, one of the most common modes of travel, even in Charleston, once you left Charleston, there weren't really streets. So you didn't really take a horse and buggy around most of the places. The waterways were more or less your route of travel. So there were dugout canoes, great big dugout canoes that were made out of cypress called periaguas, or periaguas, or paraguas, if you happen to be Spanish. But essentially real fancy dugout canoes that you'd sometimes have a sail on so that you could take advantage of wind to get across bays that were used on the inland waterway, really, that existed behind our barrier and sea islands. So, you can get to the Savannah River then, but then, even with a team of 8 rowing slaves or servants, you'd have a hard time getting up the strong current coming down the Savannah River before damming, right? So it's a whole lot easier to ride a boat down than it was up, right? This makes sense. And there was an already well-established route from Charleston to Fort Moore because the British military used that to reach the outpost. And there was a general trade between Fort Moore and Charleston, which ran just up above the Edisto River and directly into Fort Moore. So my thought is he probably possibly took this land route into Fort Moore, and he probably took the water route out, and the plants can help us with some of that. I'm amazed, knowing that Catesby visited Fort Moore, and knowing that Catesby walked up the Savannah River as far as the fall line at least to see the rocky shoals, that he didn't say anything about maybe the most charismatic plant in the entire southeastern United States. Thousands of these occur just below the I-20 bridge on the Savannah River. Thousands of them occur on the rocky shoals on Stevens Creek. He had to cross both. He must not have been there the day that they were flowering. But he did, in fact, encounter and apparently described this plant, Hymenocallis crassifolia, a swampy relative of swamps and tidal marshes and tidal swamp forests along the Blackwater and Brownwater rivers farther downstream. He drew something that kind of resembles it. But apparently he drew it when he was back in England quite a long time later. He painted this and made the etchings for this wonderful etching here. This is more similar to a European species, a European genus, than it is the Hymenocallis that we just looked at. But the spider lilies that he saw, certainly he must have modeled something similar that he thought was related in Europe when he did it. But what he said about it, he says, these plants I saw growing in a bog near Paluchicula, an Indian town on the Savannah River within the precinct of Georgia. There is a place, still today, Paluchicula Wildlife Management Areas in Hampton County, South Carolina. It probably is close to the Indian town of Paluchicula. And that could have been on the Georgia side, it could have been on the South Carolina side. It was difficult to say what was Georgia and what was South Carolina in those days. But certainly the higher bank of the river is on the Georgia side, so it's easier to travel the Georgia side than the swampy South Carolina side. That makes me think that at least one of his routes into and out of Fort Moore must have been by water. Right? The land route we can kind of get to by looking at some of the plants that he collected that he did not illustrate even. which are telltale because they grow on high, dry, sandy ground in between Columbia and Aiken, but not close to the Savannah River. These are plants of the deep, high sand hills that you find more frequently miles away from North Augusta, right? And if you were coming up the Savannah River, the only place you'd have a chance of seeing these would be in Tillman, in Jasper. Any of these sandy plants would be near Tillman on the Jasper-Hampton County line. So things like Nalina georgiana, things like Astragalus michowii, and things like Allium cuthbertii, which are all these numbers I'm putting here are the actual sheet number, the folio number within the collections. And Chrysoma passiflosculosa. All of those plants, you'd have to leave the Savannah River corridor, and you'd have to leave the richer, siltier soils to actually find. And that tells us that he didn't stay at Fort Moore. Like he describes, he was venturing out from Fort Moore, but maybe those plants were collected on the route in through Fort Moore, which we know went through the high, dry sandhills where these things made a home. There is an alternate land route that every other explorer after him would take. When we talk about Bartram and Fraser and Michaud journeying up here in 1787, 1775, we see them taking a well-worn trail, a well-worn road, down here to a place called Two Sisters Ferry, which is in northern Jasper County, crossing the river. Two Sister Ferries didn't exist then, but maybe there was still something, right? Crossing to the Georgia side, and then making the route up to Savannah Fort, to Fort Moore, and crossing over north of Fort Moore, where the Rocky Shoals are at the I-20 bridge. We know that John Fraser did this. We know that André Michaud did this, and we're pretty sure that that some of the plants that they collected in common, like bottlebrush buckeye, which they both listed in their inventory back to France and England in the same year, were collected right here where the I-20 bridge is, because there's no other known population within 400 miles of there, right? It also happens to be a great spot for catalpa, which Fraser, Michaud, and Catesby all had in their collections. The question has been, we know he went to Fort Moore. Where did he go from there? Where did he go from there? Can we tell? Well, there's a few places we know that he went to from there, but we don't know how far. Some scholars think that he just journeyed up a little ways, and the things that he had that came from the mountains may have been traded down to him or brought to him by other people, by Native Americans that were trading at the fort. Certainly, it was difficult to travel up here. Now we're talking about Lake Jocassee when we're looking at this map being up here. And the reason for that was because the Creek and the Cherokee hated each other, okay? They were at war. So you didn't travel lightly with the guides that he had up into Cherokee territory, right? All right, so did he really make it as far as the Southern Blue Ridge, or did he make it this far, or did he make it only to here, okay? Well, if we look at a modern map, the route that I'm proposing that he took was right here along the edge of the Savannah River on high ground, where today essentially highways run, highways like Highway 28, Highway 221. So these highways run right along the edge of the Savannah River, and they're ancient highways. This was a well-worn trail. We know that André Michaud walked this route. We know that that William Bartram walked this route, and we know that John Fraser walked this route. And I'm absolutely sure that Mark Catesby made it at least as far as where I live, which a place that's now under Lake Hartwell. So places we know he went. The Rocky Shoals, he talks about killing 6 sturgeon, 300 to 350 pound sturgeon, which were so plentiful then you could walk across the river on them. Today they're endangered, right? But this is an anadromous fish that came up to the Rocky Shoals to spawn. And the things he described, when we talk about things changing, he describes black bears fishing for herring, right? Herring are anadromous. Before the dams we built on the Savannah River, they came right up here to spawn. And he talks about them lining the banks of the Savannah River. We don't think about black bear fishing. They're not the most adept fishermen, but I did get this video when I was in Hydro, Alaska, of a black bear, and it's kind of interesting. They don't look quite as adept at it as grizzly bears, but they'll do it for fish, okay? And you read Catesby's account of them using shovels to shovel herring out of the streams. And even a fisherman as bad as him could get fish, right? don't know if Ed, you remember this bear, but he was about an hour trying to catch a fish, never caught one, so he took the leftovers from a grizzly bear that had left on the bank. Black bear, very opportunistic. So we know that he made it there. But we also can now maybe put some pinpoints on other places that he might have made it to, because these plants have very narrow edaphic zones that they live in. They're plants that are only associated with very unusual rock types that only occur in a couple places along the route, any possible route that Mark Catesby could have made through the Carolinas. So Carolina larkspur was collected by John Fraser, named by Thomas Welter, collected at the same spot that I believe that Mark Catesby also stood, which is right along the right-hand side of Highway 28 when you come over the dam, the Thurman Dam, from Georgia back into South Carolina. Delphinium carolinianum is a little larkspur. It's really common out in the Midwest, out in Montana, South Dakota, Indiana, Illinois, but it's very uncommon in the Carolinas. As a matter of fact, its whole range in South Carolina is 2 counties. Aiken County, where we found it a few years ago, way out here, pretty far away from where we think Mark Catesby would have gone, and then 2 locations in McCormick County. Okay? Also grows in Georgia. Maybe he found it in Georgia. Maybe he did encounter it in Georgia if he was on the Georgia side. We have no way of truly knowing which side of the river he was on. But if we assume that he was taking the same path, because Highway 28 was a well-worn trade route for hundreds of years before his visit, if we assume he crossed at the shoals here into South Carolina, where the dam is built today, essentially, into South Carolina and encountered it here where unusual rock type called gabbro is, be the same place that we know that John Fraser had collected it. The only other site is here, which is also not far from the major routes of the time, at a place called Stevens Creek. I don't believe he went to Stevens Creek. If he'd gone to Stevens Creek, he would have collected Lake Miccosukee gooseberry and shooting star and yellow-flowered magnolia. He wouldn't have missed that to get a very rare plant that only grows on top of one rock at Stevens Creek, right? But maybe. But those are 2 possibilities, and maybe there were more. But the rock type doesn't exist anywhere else in that region of South Carolina that allows this plant to grow. He also collected other plants that suggest to us that maybe he was collecting in McCormick County. Asarum canadense, for instance, was in McCormick County, and it's also known from way up here in the northern part of Berkeley County, in a place that I think he would have had a hard time getting through Hellhole Swamp at that time, even though that doesn't show on the map. So we can pretty well put a dot that he visited somewhere in McCormick or Effingham County, okay? He also collected another edaphic endemic that is only found on gabbro, Clematis acroluca. This guy was standing on gabbro. He was standing on these really high magnesium soils derived from really high magnesium rocks. There's no question about it if he was the one who actually collected the plants that are in his collection. Right? And again, you look at the range. It couldn't have come from down here. It came from upstream of Fort Moore. Trillium are a great thing to look at to kind of get a hint of what's going on because, of course, everybody loves them. Trillium maculatum, very common in the low country, and of course, he collected that plant. He also collected what would become Trillium catesbyi. Trillium catesbyi's range goes all the way down to Burke County, Georgia, and Aiken County, South Carolina. It doesn't really tell us that much. Trillium discolor goes all the way down. Geez, same thing, we can't really tell that much. But he collected Trillium cuneatum. And Trillium cuneatum only goes down as far as Abbeville County. Now, a lot of the plants that tell us the most about where Mark Catesby went are plants that have had a confused taxonomy in the past. So Trillium maculatum and Trillium cuneatum were formerly thought to be the same species. Until John Freeman revised the genus in the 70s, they were the same species. And we are so slow in botany, Ed calls us prosimians, that we don't change things very well, and we're hesitant to change records. There is no Trillium cuneatum in the coastal plain. There is no Trillium cuneatum anywhere south of Abbeville County today in South Carolina. The fact that he collected both maculatum and cuneatum means he must have made it as far as Abbeville County unless the range of these plants has changed in the time period since Catesby visited. But when we really get into how far he might have traveled, we can look at things that aren't necessarily edaphic endemics to pinpoint one site. We can look at some generally broad things. Hydrangea arborescens, for instance, is a plant that in our area it's very common in Oconee County, but you do find populations of it all the way down to Jasper County. Hints that he was in the mountains or at least in the upstate. It doesn't really nail it. But there's another specimen from the Sloan herbarium right here. Has these wonderful bracts on the side of the flower, and it has bright silver backs to the leaf, which is Hydrangea Radiata. This is an example of a southern Blue Ridge escarpment endemic, like a Coney Bells. It's not to be expected in Aiken County. If we find it in Aiken County, I would be amazed. But it is endemic to the Savannah and Upper Saluda River drainages, and it's most common from where the dam in Anderson is on Lake Hartwell up through the Blue Ridge Escarpment here. And some of these counties that are shaded green on the USDA maps are actually not Hydrangea Radiata. They're a newly described or newly recognized species, Hydrangea cinerea. So it's really a southern Appalachian, southern Blue Ridge Escarpment endemic. He also collected 2 species of Leucothea, and I think he actually illustrated Leucothea fontanesiana in the Natural History because the long tips to the leaves are not characteristic of the coastal dog hobble. But again, the 2 species of dog hobble have been confused in the past, so that Leucothea axillaris, the coastal dog hobble, used to include Leucothea fontanesiana, which has a mostly mountainous southern Appalachian range, and Catesby collected both, right? And James Reveal, when he published a list of the species that are illustrated in Mark Catesby, may have been using older taxonomy because he calls this the plant in the description Leucothea axillaris. Certainly his description of it being from Virginia and from the wetlands of Virginia, you would assume axillaris, but I think he may have been actually looking at Leucothea fontanesiana when he drew or painted the painting, which is right now on display down at the Gibbs in Charleston. But again, you look at that plant, it extends down today only to Anderson County on the South Carolina side. So if he was traveling in South Carolina, one would assume he might have made it to Anderson County. And then there was the plant that got me to love Catesby so much. Sitting in the Natural History Museum, we're paging through, and Amy remembers my plant-gasm that I had when I saw Lysimachia fraseri, which wouldn't be named for 130 years after Catesby. And here it was, collected by him or someone who gave it to him, hopefully by him. And there was no question. This is Lysimachia fraseri. Lysimachia fraseri is not just an Edaphic endemic, it's a southern Blue Ridge Escarpment endemic, and we're very sure of the southernmost location for this because it was lost when Lake Hartwell was flooded. It occurred right at the dam for Lake Hartwell. Fraser's loosestrife allows us to actually put a point and say, you know, Occam's razor would say that the most accepted explanation for where Catesby went means that Catesby must have traveled as far as Anderson County. It's a lot less likely that something that's a southern Blue Ridge Escarpment endemic would be found anywhere farther downstream than these 3 species I've just shown you right now, which all 3 used to occur together there, where today they've been flooded by Lake Hartwell, right? So Catesby says, within sight of the mountains, and this is what I look at every single morning when I drive from down near the dam in Anderson County up to Clemson, and within sight of the mountains. When you consider the landscape that Catesby was traveling in was also so much less treed than the landscape today. Don't you think you could see the vista from Anderson the same way we do when we're driving down the highway? So I think, and it's just I think, I'm not a historian, but the part I love about this is you could actually build an argument based upon the plants that Catesby collected, or at least that ended up in his collection, that his collection, his travels, would have taken him on a land route up the Savannah River, up the Tougaloo, to right about here, to Anderson or Clemson, as far as he could get into Cherokee territory without really getting into trouble. And then the best way back, water route. So that's my thoughts on where Catesby went. But I want you to remember that Catesby tells us so much more, and there's so much more information. We could talk for hours and hours on what we've gleaned and what we think we know today better based upon what we've seen from these early colonial era collections. Don't forget that you do have to kind of trust Catesby. Yeah? He tells the truth about the rattlesnake. They ain't that dangerous. He tells the truth about the bear. Ain't gonna hurt you unless it's really starving, right? He was kind of tough. And he drew a cowbird. We used to think cowbirds invaded South Carolina, North Carolina in the 1950s. Obviously, it came from out west because there were no bison here. Since the 1950s, we've discovered lots of letters that were written back talking about bison here. We know from Catesby's work that bison were here. We know from the skins that were shipped back to Spain and France and England that bison were here. And we know the bird that associated with them were here. And we know why they were here. They were here because people were burning the landscape every year in the spring to create grass, to create bison, to create elk, to create the game that also led to a higher quality of life for them and their families. So we can take a lot away from this story, and we can really start to apply it, not just to history, not just to the distribution of plants the way they are today, but to think about how the world has changed and how powerful the human hand has been in pulling the lever that advances that change. Catesby talks about 3 feet of soil here, topsoil. You ever seen 3, 4 feet as topsoil? We got it at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. We have a virgin piece of ground that had never been plowed. We were just super lucky that we got John C. Calhoun's cattle operation used to be over top of where the Piedmont Prairie is today. We have 9 acres of incredibly beautiful virgin soil that was created under the prairie grasses that were foraged under 18,000 years of Native American burning. Those same soils were washed away everywhere when people like Catesby came here and they said, oh, look at this soil. And his description of the soils. If you haven't read the appendix and read an account of Carolina, you got to go home and read it tonight. Okay? UNC Library, University of Wisconsin Library, you can read it almost anywhere. There's lots of copies of Catesby online. Go read that and read the account of the soil. It'll make you sick. He says, and these Indians burn the whole thing. They don't grow it. What are they doing? They could be growing cotton and corn and all these wonderful products, but they're not. Okay? What a great thing to exploit this will be. And of course we did. Every inch of it we planted with cotton, corn, and rice. And by the early 1800s, that soil had started to migrate down to Savannah and Charleston, hadn't it? And 18,000 years of human legacy was washed downstream with it. Right? And what we were left with is that beautiful soil we all have in our backyard today. Right? That beautiful Bricard red clay, which isn't topsoil. It's subsoil. Our soil's down in Savannah Harbor. Okay? And we can thank our forefathers for that. Well, we wore out those cotton fields to the 1930s, and then the boll weevil came, and we couldn't force people to work for nothing. We had no slaves, so it was much less profitable, right? You couldn't exploit it as badly, and we'd worn the soil out anyway, and the boll weevil was just the last nail in the coffin. We all moved into mill towns. We abandoned the fields. The fields grew up into trees, and we think of that as natural, don't we? Natural. And it's only existed since the 1930s. But whose choice was it that led to the trees? Ours. Whose choice was it that it was cotton? Ours. Whose choice was it that it was prairie? Ours. Before that, there were woolly mammoths running around. I don't think it's any kind of analog, right? Catesby is the best window that we have to peer back into that past that predates pictures and allows us to really grasp and reclaim our true responsibility and our heritage to the land. So I hope you enjoyed my little tale about Mark Catesby. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions about what I talked about tonight, if anyone has questions about that. Yes, Dan?
Were there ever any soil samples, cores taken out of the prairie over here?
Yeah, at the Botanical Garden? Yeah, well, we dug soil pit over there, and we did have the soil analyzed, when we first, through the Clemson Soils Lab. It's kind of, it's circumneutral. pH was 6.4, 6.5, really high in magnesium, semi-high in calcium, rich organic matter. It's exactly what everyone wants to have in their garden, and it's 4 feet deep. Yeah. As far as we only check the top 10 centimeters of the topsoil when we send out a soil sample like that. We haven't checked anything deeper, but the trench where we dug, where today you walk a trail through the prairie, that was a 4-foot deep trench that we dug through there for the water line, the water main that we ran through there to bring water to the whole Natural Heritage Garden. And that's when my jaw dropped. Before that, I had no idea that we had any virgin soil anywhere in the garden. And those of like today, we walked out, and you don't need a shovel to dig in the Piedmont Prairie. Just stick your hands down and you pull out a whole hand, and that soil will not compact. It's a mollisol. It's a grassland soil. You can't make a clay ball out of it. It just falls apart in your hand. It's been built by 18,000 years of grassroots, adding organics to and breaking down soil. Pretty cool. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I understand that when the bowl came through, they used arsenic on the cotton,
Mm-hmm.
and I've heard that in California, rice growers were growing rice, and the baby food people were using rice syrup, and they found out that they had arsenic in their baby food, and it was supposed to be organic. Does arsenic live that long, in the forest that we have now?
Sure. Arsenic is pretty long-lived toxin in soil. It really doesn't go anywhere unless it's carried somewhere. So it's not going to dissipate out atmospherically. It's going to be incorporated as trace elements into life, and it will wash, but it binds also. So it's not the easiest thing to leach from soil either. So it does have a long activity period. Yeah. But the amounts of arsenic that were used in cotton culture are probably not great enough to cause any kind of damage. They're probably more like on the nutritive level of what you need in your diet of arsenic, even in fields that were treated heavily. These days. It's been a while. Anybody else have a question? Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for coming. I guess we're done.